All right, welcome to the Laravel and Vue SPA tutorial. In this series, we're going to be learning how to build real-world single-page applications with Vue powered by a Laravel API. To do that, we're going to be building one of everyone's favorite applications, a to-do list app. But we're going to add a few features to spice it up that'll make it a little different from other tutorials that you may have seen. Now, before we jump in, one thing this series doesn't cover is how to get your PC or your machine set up running when creating Laravel applications. So if you need that information, I created a separate video that I'll link to in the description below. All right, let's write some code. So the first thing you want to do when you're scaffolding this project is decide on a project folder structure. And the way I like to do this is build one folder for my API and one folder for my front end or my client. And so first things first, we need to make a directory that's going to house all of this code. So we're going to open a terminal window, navigate to any programming directory, and type mkdir what to do. And we'll cd into that folder. Now in here, we're going to have a client folder and an API folder, but we're not going to make those manually. We're going to use Laravel and Vue to create those folders for us. So first, let's create our Laravel project by running Laravel new API. All right, now that that's done, we're going to build our Vue client folder by running npm create Vue at latest. And we're going to title this client. We're not going to be using TypeScript in this series, but I do recommend getting familiar with it. We're not going to be using JSX support. We will use Vue Router, and we will use Pinia. We're not going to use vtest, and we're not going to use an end-to-end testing solution. We will go ahead and add ESLint, and we will add Prettier. All right, now that we've got our API and our client folders, we're going to open this up in Visual Studio Code. And if that's what you're using for your editor, there's a neat shortcut that you can use by just typing code space period. All right, now you see we have an API and a client. So first things first, let's open up a terminal. And then since we're going to be using one to run our front end and one to run our back end, we're going to open up another terminal. For this series, we're going to be using Laravel Sanctum to handle all of our authentication and Fortify to make that a little quicker. So in our first terminal window, let's navigate into our API folder. And in our second terminal window, we're going to navigate into our client folder. Now back in the first terminal window, we want to install Sanctum. So we're going to type php artisan install API. And we're not going to run the database migrations because we haven't updated our env file yet, so we'll just say no. Since we're using Sanctum and an SPA, we want to publish our cores file so that we have a little bit more control over the configuration. You can do that by running php artisan config publish cores. All right, so now let's open up our API folder. And this is where you have all your Laravel files. So the first thing we're going to do is tell Laravel's application that we want to use the stateful API Sanctum middleware. So you're going to open up your Bootstrap folder and open up app.php. And inside of with middleware, you're going to add middleware stateful API. So next, we're going to install Laravel Fortify, and that's going to set us up with everything we need for user registration, login, etc. So to do so, we're going to type composer require Laravel Fortify. And now that we added that package, we're going to run php artisan Fortify install. And now we've got everything we need from Fortify to work with our user registration, login, etc. Now the next thing we want to do is set up our env file to work with our MySQL database and set up SQLite. So we're going to uncomment these lines. We're going to change the database connection to MySQL. And the database name is going to be what to do. The username should be root, and the password will be the password for that user. And then you can save. Now, if you want to see some of the roots that were created by Fortify, you can type in php artisan route list create. And this will show you pretty much everything that Fortify created, including logins, registers, reset passwords, two-factor challenges, and a bunch of other cool stuff. Now that we've got our database hooked up, we can run our initial migrations to make sure our database has all the tables and the fields that we need to work with our users. So we can run php artisan migrate. And now the database doesn't exist yet, so we're going to say yes, we'd like to create it. And there you go. Migrations have been run. Now one other environment variable that we want to add is the Sanctum stateful domains. And we're going to add the localhost 5173 port. And that's just going to tell Sanctum that we want to allow cookies and authentication from that domain. And the localhost port 5173 is going to be our front-end Vue application. Now let's open up our cores file, and we're going to make a few updates. First, we're going to add the login and the register root to our paths. And next, we're going to update supports credentials to true. Now, as you can see here, API/wildcard is already added. So everything that gets added in our API routes is going to already be taken care of for us by Sanctum, but we need the login and the register routes to be accounted for as well. We can close that file. The last thing you want to do before you close your env file is change your session driver to cookie and change the session domain to localhost. Now you can close your env file. Now that we've got most of our scaffolding built, let's actually run our application. So in our API terminal, we're going to run php artisan serve. And then in our client terminal, one more thing that we have to run is npm install. All right. And now we can run npm run dev. All right. So now we can open up a web browser and navigate to localhost 5173. And there you go. We got a Vue application running. Now, we're going to minimize our API folder and we're going to open up our client. And the first thing we want to do is get rid of some of the default scaffolding that's shipped with Vue and start fresh with a brand new project. So we're going to open up our source folder, open up views. So if you open up your app.vue, we're going to get rid of Hello World. And we're going to get rid of just about everything in here except for router view. And we're going to get rid of the router link import. And we can remove all the styles. All right, and we'll save. Now we still see some content, and we're going to get rid of that as well. So we'll open up home view, and inside here, get rid of the welcome import, get rid of the welcome component, and save. All right, so before we get started with any more code, we're going to install a few more things on our front end. So open up your front end client terminal, press Control-C to stop the server. Now we're going to run npm install Axios. Now that that's installed, and we're also going to be using Tailwind in this series. If you haven't used Tailwind before, it may be a little daunting, but don't worry too much. It's just a styling library for CSS, which makes it really easy to create components and elements and style them without ever leaving your HTML. So we're also going to run npm install Tailwind CSS Pete. Perfect. Now let's set up our Tailwind installation by opening our Vite config file and importing Tailwind. Now down under plugins, we're going to add the Tailwind CSS plugin and save. All right, now we want to open up our assets, open up main.css. We're going to get rid of everything in here, including the import, and we're going to import Tailwind CSS. Save. Now just for a little bit of styling, we're going to add a few things. We're going to add body. We're going to say background E. And we're going to say header background F. All right. Now we can close our main. We can close our Vite config. Now before we go too much farther with getting started with our authentication, we need to update our main.js and add a few things to our Axios installation. So up here, we're going to import Axios from Axios. And we're going to change some of the default settings. We're going to say Axios defaults base URL. We're going to set that to our API. I'm going to say Axios defaults with credentials true and with XSRF token true. Now I like semicolons, so I'm just going to add semicolons and we'll save this file. Now what these two settings do is with credentials will allow Axios to use cookies on cross-site access control requests, basically saying that when it communicates with the API, we want it to pass the cookies along with it. And the XSRF token makes sure that we're passing the CSRF token from Laravel with each of these requests. Don't worry about that too much. We're going to see how this all works in just a minute. So now that we've got these packages installed and a few of the settings adjusted, let's run our front end again. So now we're going to open up our router folder and look at index.js. So what this file does is essentially creates the linking that Vue Router is going to use so that we can navigate throughout our app and show different components. Because this is a single page application, there's no individual pages. Everything is served from one JavaScript file, but the individual pages and the routing is handled by this router file. So as you can see here, the default path is named home, and we pass in a component home view, which is imported right here. There's also a path /about, named about, which is essentially lazy loading the components. And what this does is it ensures that we're not loading all of our components on the page unnecessarily before they're rendered. And that's just a performance optimization by Vue. So now let's open our about. We'll get rid of the style, and we'll get rid of this class, and we'll leave everything else. And we're also going to add a script setup block. We're going to move this up top. Now inside of our components folder, we're going to add a new folder, and we're going to call this layout. And we're going to make a new file inside of this folder called header section.vue. We'll add a script setup block. We'll add a template block. And we'll add a header. And this is essentially going to be the top navigation bar that is present on all of our pages. So one thing we want to do is we want to import our router link from Vue Router. And if you use HTML before, a router link is very similar to an anchor tag, an A tag, and it essentially just provides a link to Vue Router to say, hey, we want to navigate to this page. So now inside header, you're going to start to see a little Tailwind. So now in our header, we're going to add a div. We're going to make sure this is only a certain max width, center it, and add a little bit of padding. Then we'll create another div, space the items apart, make sure they're aligned vertically. Now we'll add our page title, and we'll add a nav. We're going to say flex. And now in here, we're just going to add a couple links. Now let's head back to our app view. We're going to go ahead and we're going to import our header section. In our template, we're going to add this header section as a component by typing header section with a closing tag. And if you save that, you'll see we have a little bit of a separation here. We have our white header and we have our slightly darker body area. One thing I noticed I didn't do was properly add this div. So we're going to move our nav up inside of the flex div and save that. And there you go. Now you have a title with a home and about page. Now let's open up our home view. And inside here, we're just going to add a paragraph tag and say, this is home. And we'll save. And now you can see that shows up on our home page. And now if we click the about link, look at that. This is an about page. And up in the URL bar, we see /about. And now we can navigate. So we've got some basic navigation. We're just going to take this main block out of our home view. And what we're going to do is we're going to open up our app. And we're essentially going to say, anytime that we render something from router view, we want to just wrap that in a main block. And we can style this main block with a class. And we'll say max width 7XL, MX auto, padding 4. And there we go. So let's get into some authentication. Let's close a few of these files. Now in our header section, let's add a couple more things. We're going to add a router link to login. And we're going to add a router link to register. And then we can delete these few files that were scaffolded with Vue, the hello world, the welcome, and the welcome item. Now if your JS config throws an error, just open it up, save it. Now inside of our views folder, let's create a new folder, and we'll call this auth. Inside there, we'll add a new file. We'll call this login view. We'll create another new file and call this register view. So first, we'll work on the register. and add a paragraph tag. Now inside our login view, we're going to do something similar, just so that we don't get any errors. We're going to add the script setup block. We're going to add a template block. Let's just add a div and a paragraph that says login. Now inside of our index.js, we're going to add a couple paths so that we can navigate to these areas. Add one for login. We're going to use the same lazy loading. We'll do the same for our register. And make sure you add auth after your views directory, and we'll save that. All right. Now, we have the create our account block, and we have a login block. So if you go over to your app, you should be able to click on login, register, and there you go. Now you can navigate throughout your app, and you have a few pages built. And before we jump into authentication, I just want to show a quick example for those of you who haven't used Vue before. And this is going to be a quick example of how reactive variables work inside of Vue. So inside of our register view, we're going to import ref from Vue. And now we're going to create a variable. And I'll do this very simply with a counter. We'll set that to ref0. Now, if I want to access this variable inside of my Vue component, I can add a paragraph tag and say counter. And then similar to a lot of templating languages, you add double braces and you say counter. Now, if I save, you can see on the right, there's a counter at 0. Now, what if we want to change that? Well, let's add two functions. We're going to make a function called increment. And we're going to make a function called decrement. And all these functions are going to do are modify the value of the counter variable. And we're going to add 1. And here, we're going to modify the value of the counter variable, and we're going to subtract 1. Now, to access these functions from within our Vue component, we need to build a couple buttons. So we'll say button type equals button. And we'll say increment. And now to access the method, we're going to use @ and type click equals increment. And now we're going to do the same thing for a decrement button. And now we'll save. Now, if you look on your page here and you click on one of these buttons, you'll see that the counter variable changes. And all that happens without ever reloading the page. And you can click decrement, and that goes down. Increment, that goes back up. And that's an extremely simple example of how reactive states in Vue work. All right, so we don't need any of that. We're going to get rid of it. But I wanted to show this because we're about to move on to building our auth state management, and we're going to use a lot of reactive states. So I wanted to make sure we had a basic concept of how that worked before we jump into it. So now in our stores folder, you can see there's already a counter store that was built from Vue. We're going to go ahead and delete that. And we're going to create a new file and call this auth.js. Now this is going to be our primary state management area for everything authentication related. And so let's jump into it. First, we're going to import define store from Pinia. And we're also going to import ref and computed from Vue. Now we're going to import Axios, which is what we're going to use to make requests to our API. And we're going to define our main export, which we're going to call use auth store. And that's passed a string and a function. And now in here is where we define everything related to our auth store. So first, we're going to define our user as an empty object. And we're going to define a few variables. And one is going to be authenticated, which is going to be default to false. One is going to be is auth resolved, and that's going to default to false. And now we're going to use a couple computed variables. And what these do is essentially create read-only properties that are accessible by other parts of our app. We're going to create is authenticated equals computed We're going to pass it a function of authenticated dot value. So what that's doing is we're going to be returning this is authenticated variable, and we're going to allow other parts of our application to access it. And what it's going to do is basically check the state of the authenticated variable and return its value. Next, we're going to find two functions. One is set authenticated, and that gets passed a value. And what we'll do is update our authenticated value to the value passed in. We'll do something similar for const set user equals a function that gets passed user data. And we're going to set the value of our user to that user data. All right. Now we're going to define a few functions that are going to be extremely necessary. One is going to be our login function, which is going to be asynchronous. And that function is going to take in credentials. We're going to define our register function, which is also going to take credentials. We're going to define a logout function. And we're going to define an attempt function. Now, the only one that may not seem obvious is this attempt function. And what it's going to do is basically try to grab the user object from our API. And if it succeeds, it's going to store that in the user state. And if it fails, it's going to set everything to the default values and let our application know that we weren't able to authenticate. One more computed variable that we want to add is current user. And that's going to grab the user value. All right. So the last piece that we have to do before we start building out some of this functionality is tell this store what we're going to be returning to the application. So we're going to return. We're going to pass back some of the variables and some of the methods that we just created. We'll pass back current user, pass back is authenticated, is auth resolved, login, register, logout, and attempt. All right, so let's jump into it and try to get a response from our API. We're going to jump into our attempt method and create a try catch block. And I added this finally clause as well, because essentially we're going to perform some functionality here. And if there's an error, we're going to perform some functionality here. And then no matter what happens, we want to set the is auth resolved value to true. Because whether we are successfully logged in or not, the state of the authentication is resolved. So we're basically telling the application, hey, we were able to grab the user data or we weren't able to grab the user data, but either way, we determined whether we're logged in or not. So now in here, we're going to say this variable response equals await Axios get /API/user. And that's going to make a GET request to our API at the endpoint API/user. And then we want to console log the response. And I know there's a few errors here. They're not really errors. They're ESLint telling us that we declared some variables that aren't being used yet, which is totally fine. So now let's see if we can get this attempt to work and reach out to our API. So we're going to open up our main.js. And up here, we're going to import use auth store. And now after our app is initialized and Pinia has been initialized, down here, we're going to say this variable auth equals use auth store. And what that's doing is basically saying we want to give this variable access to everything that we returned from this use auth store. So now that auth variable will have access to current user and all these methods. So what we're going to do is say auth.attempt, which is one of those methods. And then we'll say finally, we'll pass back a function. And this way, once that attempt is finished, we could perform some action. Don't worry about that right now. And then we're going to mount the app. So let's save that. And if you open up your dev tools and you open up console, you can look and there's an error that the server responded with a status of 401 unauthorized. That's awesome. That means that we successfully reached out to our API and got a response back that said, hey, you're not authorized. Now, if you want to test that this is working, you can open up our API, open up our routes, open up API, and you can see this is where our user is being requested from. Any routes that you create inside of this folder automatically get the API endpoint added to the beginning. So although this just says /user, it's really /API/user. You don't need to add API yourself. But just to see an example of this working, we'll comment this out. We'll add a new route get user, and we'll add a function without using the Sanctum middleware, and we'll just say return response JSON message hello. And we'll pass back a 200 status code and we'll save. Now, if you refresh our page, we're currently in the user section, but if you go to all messages, you'll see that we connected and we got a response here. And if you open that up, you can look down in data and there's our message, hello. So now we're successfully getting data from the API. So now we're going to get rid of this function and we're going to uncomment because we do want to use the auth sanctum middleware on pretty much every API route that we're going to be creating. And so we'll leave that as is for now. Now you can see in our API routes, we only have one route. But if you remember, when we ran PHP artisan route list, we saw a bunch of routes that were listed that Fortify created. And a few of those are the login and register routes. So now while we don't need to dig into exactly what those routes are doing, we can go into our app, actions, Fortify, and look at our create new user file. And you can see here that create expects a name, an email, and a password. So let's try to pass it some of that data. And just for fun, if you do ever want to see what the routes look like, you can open up your vendor, Laravel folder, open Fortify, go into routes, and open up the routes folder, and you can see exactly what's being done in every single one of these routes. It's a little overwhelming how much data is in here, so don't worry about it too much. I'm going to show you exactly how it works. So let's close our API and go back to our auth.js inside of our Vue application, and let's create some functionality for the register method. So one thing to note is that before any login or registration action can happen, we need to grab the CSRF cookie, which includes that CSRF token from our Laravel application. And to do that, we can say await Axios get Sanctum /CSRF -cookie. And don't worry too much about what this does, but essentially we're grabbing the CSRF token from our Laravel application and storing it inside of our Axios instance. And the reason we do that is so that in future requests, we can send that cookie with every single request, and that tells Laravel that we're not a malicious user. We're also going to add that to our login. And now this just ensures that before any login or registration action happens, we grab that token from our Laravel API and make sure that we're a valid human being trying to access the API. Now for our register function, we're going to make a try catch, and we're going to wait a post request to /register with the credentials that we pass, and then we're going to try the attempt method. And if that works, we'll return null. If it doesn't work, we'll create an error message saying registration failed with the error. And we'll return the error. And we'll do something very similar for our login method. Now we're going to post to the login route with the credentials. And then we're going to try the attempt method, turn null. And the same thing here. If there's an error, we'll create an error in the console. Login failed with that error message. And we'll return the error. Now we've got a login and a register method. Now before we leave our auth store, one last thing we want to do is update our attempt. We store that data in the store. We'll use our set user function, and we'll pass response data, and we'll set authenticated to true. So if this GET request succeeds and there's no error, we'll set the user to the data that we receive, and we'll set the authenticated variable to true. Now, if it doesn't succeed, we want to set the user back to the default value, and we want to set authenticated to false. All right, now let's head over to our register view and start sending some data. So first, we're going to import use router and router link from Vue Router. We're also going to import our auth store that we just created. And lastly, we're going to import reactive and ref from Vue. And reactive is new. We haven't used that before, but I'm about to show you how it works. So essentially, if we want to create a form with reactive data inside that updates as you type, we're going to use reactive. And the way we do that is we create a form variable, we set it to reactive, and we pass in an object. And in that object, we're going to provide some properties. We're going to provide name, email, password, and password confirmation. And I know this naming convention isn't typical for JavaScript, but I'm using this because that's the naming convention that Laravel expects when you send back the data. So now if we want to use these properties inside of a form, we can just essentially create a form. And inside here, we would use a normal input, but we're going to use this Vue v model property and set this to form.name. We'll add a placeholder, and we'll add some simple styling. So now if you save, you can see that we have that form input in our form. Perfect. Now to ensure this form doesn't send a request to the same page and then resubmit, we want to make sure we control it with Vue. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a submit form function. And just for testing, we'll make sure this works. We'll say console log form submitted. And now down in our form, we're going to say at submit dot prevent equals submit form. Now we're going to add a div, give that some spacing on top, and add a button. With some default styling. And there you go. Now if you clear out your console and you click this register button, we can see form submitted. So there we go. Every time you click that button, the form will be submitted. Now we also want to make sure that we initialize our auth store by saying const auth equals use auth store. And we're also going to create a loading variable. And we're going to use that reactive state management and set it to false. Now at the beginning of our submit form, when that function is first triggered, we want to set the value of loading to true. We can get rid of this form submitted, and we're going to say variable error equals await auth.register. And we're going to pass in the form. Now if you remember, if you look in our auth.js, inside of register, we either get a successful response and return null, or if the response fails, we return back the error. So what this is saying is we're going to await this register function, and if it fails, we're going to get data inside of error, and if it doesn't fail, this will be empty. So now we can say if there's data inside of error, we'll say loading value equals false, and we'll say console log error, and we'll pass the error. Else, loading value equals false, and we'll console log success. Now, down here, just for fun, we're going to add another div, and we're going to use Vue's v-if method to say if our auth, and we're going to check is authenticated. So if that variable is true, this div will appear, otherwise it won't. And we're going to style it the same way we styled the other one. Okay, and now we'll add a paragraph tag. We'll say hello, and then we'll insert auth.currentUser.name. Now, if our auth is authenticated, there should be a value in auth.currentUser.name, and we're going to print that out to the screen and say hello. But as you can see, nothing shows up because currently we're not authenticated. So now let's look. We set up our register function that expects credentials, and if it gets credentials, it grabs the CSRF cookie from our Laravel application, and then it tries to push those credentials to our register route via a post request, and if that succeeds, it returns null. If it fails, it returns an error. So we're passing those credentials, and then right here, where we run this auth.register function, we're passing in the form, which is a reactive object that contains name, email, password, and password confirmation, which is exactly what Fortify's register route is expecting. So the last part we have to do is add fields for email, password, and password confirmation. So let's do that. We'll set this as a type is email. Model is form.email. Placeholder, enter your email. Class, and the class is going to be the same. Make sure that works. We can see that it's working fine. There's a little bit of spacing missing and they're a little clustered. So what we're going to do is we're going to wrap each one of these in its own div. Now if you save, you can see we have a little bit more spacing. Now the last two that we need, we're going to copy. We're just going to paste. And instead of email, we're going to use password. And we'll do the same down here. And we're going to use form.password. Enter your password. Form.password confirmation. Enter your password again. And we'll save. And we've got a full form ready to send data to our auth store, which will pass data back to our Laravel API. So let's give this a shot. Type in Lance at test.com. Password, we're just going to use test 1234. Test 1234. And now we'll click register. And look at that. We've got a success. And at the top of our page, Hello Lance popped up. That means that our auth store noticed that we were authenticated, passed back the current user's data, and we took that data and displayed it to our user inside of this view page. That's awesome. Now, one issue I can see is that if a user signs up, they shouldn't stay on this page. So rather than doing what we did, we're going to get rid of this div. And where we have use router and router link, we're going to establish that variable. Router equals use router. And now down here, instead of saying a success message, we're going to use router.push name home. And we'll get rid of that. Now, if there's a registration that happens and it's successful, we're going to kick the user back to the home page. Now, before you test this again, we need to build one more piece of functionality, and that's inside of our auth.js, and that's going to be the logout. So to create this, we're going to create a try, catch, and inside of here, we're going to await Axios post logout. We'll set the user to an empty object and set authenticated to false, return null. And if there's an error, we'll console the error, logout failed, which shouldn't happen very often. And we'll return logout failed. And we'll save. Now, before we test the logout function, there's one thing I forgot to do, and we have to open up our API config cores, and we're going to add the logout method to our list of paths. And we'll save that file. Now let's build one more thing so we can test the logout functionality. Let's go to our header section.view, and now here, we're going to add a couple things. We're going to import our use auth store, and we'll say auth equals use auth store. And now what we want to do is add logout functionality to our header. So we're going to build a function called logout, and we're going to say logout error equals await auth logout. And if you remember, inside of our auth, we only pass something back if the logout fails. So if this comes back empty, logout was a success. So back in our header section, we'll say if there's no logout error, then we want to push the user back to the home page. And let's make sure we grab router, set our router to use router. All right, now we have a logout function that'll push the user back to the home page if the logout doesn't fail. So now what we want to do is if the user's logged in, we want to show them the logout option. And if they're not logged in, we want to show them the option to log in or register. So we can use that Vue if and say if the user is not authenticated, show login. We'll do the same here. Now if they are authenticated, we want to show a button. And that button is going to trigger the logout function. All right, so if we save this, now you can see that since we just registered and we're currently logged in, we see home, about, and log out. And if we aren't logged in, then we should see the login and register pages. So let's go ahead and try to log out. And there we go. Got kicked back to the home page, and there's a login and a register route. Now we don't see the logout because we're not logged in. So now in our register view, let's fix this one ESLint error, which we imported router link, but we never used it. So let's fix that. Down at the bottom under the form, we're just going to add div, and we're going to add a router link to login. That's just going to say login. So now on our register page, it's going to be a little button that says login, and we can style that a little bit. And now if the user already has an account, they can click the login button, and that brings us to our login page. If they don't have an account, they're going to stay here, and they're going to register their account. So let's build out our login page so we can log into existing accounts. Now because our login page is going to be very similar to the register page, we're going to grab everything inside of template and copy that. And now we'll paste. Now the difference is, we'll say login to your account. And we also don't need the name, we just need an email and a password. So we're going to get rid of the name field. And we're going to get rid of the password confirmation. We'll change this button to login. And we'll change this to create an account, pointing to the register page. And now we just have to add the form and the submit form functions. So we will import reactive ref from Vue, import router link from Vue Router, and we'll import our use auth store. Auth equals use auth store. We'll say our form is a reactive object with a email and a password. Now we'll build our submit form function, which is asynchronous. And now we're going to add a loading variable, set to false. And when we submit the form, we'll set that to true. We'll say variable error equals await auth login, and we'll pass the form. And if there is a login error, loading value equals false. And we'll also create a login error. And if there's an error, we'll say login error value equals error. And for now, if there's no error, we're going to push the user back to the home page. We're eventually going to create a page that's protected by authentication, so you can only access it if you're logged in. But for now, we're just going to grab our router. So we'll import use router, and we'll say router equals use router. And now if there's no error when trying to log in, we will router push to home. And when you save, you'll see our login form with the create an account button. And if you click that, it'll take you to your register page. So now we can get back and forth. Now if we go back to our auth.js, we can see that login is taking in credentials, grabbing the CSRF cookie, and then posting to our login route with those credentials, and then attempting to see if we can grab a user. And if that all succeeds, we return nothing. And if it fails, we return an error. So in our login view, when we submit the form, we're sending that form data to auth.login, that method. And if that succeeds and there's no error, we're just going to push the user to the home page. Now, Fortify is handling all of our login, register, and logout logic. But if you want to see how that's built from scratch, let me know in the comments and I'm happy to build a video on that. Fortify is just a great solution to get all of that scaffolding done for you without having to focus too much on building that and making sure it's secure. But if you want to see exactly how that's built, just let me know. So now we'll clear our errors. And at the top of our template, we're going to add one more div. I'm going to say if login error. And we're going to display that error. And we'll give this a little bit of styling. Now in our auth.js, let's just change one more thing. And if there is an error with the login, we're just going to default this message to invalid credentials. And we'll console log the full error. So now we'll save. Back to our login view. And now we'll test this with random information. And we can see that we get invalid credentials. So we're getting a response back from the API, which is great. Now, since we're setting this loading value, we might as well use it somewhere. So down in our button, we're going to go here. And instead of just saying login, we're going to make this dynamic content and say loading. And if loading is true, we'll say logging in. Otherwise, we'll show the login. Okay, clear errors. And now you can see if we click that, it'll show that we're logging in and that it failed. All right. Now, before we test this, let's just make a brand new account and make sure that we get redirected properly. We'll say Lance, test.com, register. There we go. We got redirected. Now we can see the logout button instead of the login and register buttons. So now we can go ahead and test our logout. And there we go. Now we're logged out. Now with that brand new account, let's head over to our login and type in test, and click login. Bam. Logged in with our new account. Now to make sure that we show some data that signifies that we're logged in, we can open up our home view and we'll import use auth store. And we'll say auth equals use auth store. Now up here, we'll say if auth is authenticated, and we'll style this. And we'll just say, welcome back, auth, current user name. And we'll save. And there we go. We have a welcome message anytime you're logged in. And if we go ahead and we log out, that welcome message goes away. Perfect. Now we have a home page that shows a welcome message if our user's logged in and shows default content otherwise. So now, what if we wanted a dashboard that the user gets redirected to anytime they're logged in that shows all of their to-dos and other authenticated content? Well, now that we have our authentication working, that's pretty easy to do. So let's quickly test this out by creating a new view, and we'll call this dashboard view. Okay, and now in our router, let's go ahead and make a route for our dashboard. All right, now we've got a route for our dashboard. And if we go to our home view and we add a link here, so let's import router link. And down here, we'll add a router link to dashboard. We'll add a link that just says view dashboard. Okay, now that's great, but the problem is we're not currently logged in. And if we click view dashboard, we see the dashboard. So now what we're going to do is go back to our router index file, and we're going to add metadata. That's an object, and we're going to add require auth true. Okay, now in order to enforce this, we're going to add a little piece of middleware. So before we export the router, we're going to add middleware here. We're going to say router before each. This is going to be asynchronous with a to, a from, and a next. If you've used middleware like this before, essentially what this is doing is saying this is where we're aiming to go, this is where we're coming from, and once we process our logic, we call this next function, and that'll tell the router to proceed with whatever it's trying to do. So now what we want to do is import our use auth store. Say auth equals use auth store. And now if the auth is not resolved, so if attempt hasn't completed, we want to await that auth attempt function. Now that we know that we've checked to see if the user is authenticated, so if they're logged in or not, we can say if we check the root that we're trying to access, we check the metadata, we see if it requires authentication, and then we check to see if the user is not authenticated, then what's going to happen is we're going to move on with the request, but we're going to redirect the user to the login page. So essentially what this is saying is that if the place that we're trying to go requires authentication and the user is not authenticated, we want to kick them to the login page. Otherwise, we can just proceed with the intended action, and we'll save that. And now if you saw that when we saved here, we got redirected to our login page because we're not currently logged in. If we go home, we can still see the Vue dashboard link, but if we click that, we're going to get redirected to login, which is working exactly the way it should. We shouldn't be able to access the dashboard unless we actually have a logged in account. So now let's try this. Log in with our test. And we have our welcome message that shows that we're logged in. And now if we click View Dashboard, bam, dashboard shows up and we have a protected route that is only accessible if you're currently logged into an account. So the only other issue that I want to clean up before we finish this up is that if we're logged in and we navigate to register, the auth is checked and we see that we're logged in, but we still allow the user to view the registration page. That's something we want to prevent. And it's very simple. Using the exact same functionality that we just built for requires auth, we're going to go into our router, and for our login in our register page, we're going to add that metadata. But instead of require auth, we're going to say guest true. We're going to do the same for register. Now what we're going to do is we're going to add an else if statement here. If the intended route does not require authentication, this will get checked. And we're going to say if the intended route is a guest route and the user is authenticated, we want to pass them to the dashboard. So we'll save that. Now you can see we just ended up on dashboard. So if we type in register, and we try to access the registration page, now we automatically get redirected to the dashboard because we're logged into an account and the app knows, hey, if you're logged in and you're trying to access a guest-only page, send them to the dashboard. So there we go. Basic authentication with a Vue SPA communicating with a Laravel API. Now we did use Laravel Fortify, which handles a lot of that background logic. So if you want to see that explained in full detail or done from scratch, just let me know and I'd be happy to do so. If you got stuck anywhere along the way, just leave a comment and I'd be happy to answer any questions. So now that authentication is out of the way, in our next video, we're going to work on creating and displaying to-do list items, making sure they're only accessible by the user that created them, and updating their state. So that's going to involve a lot of Laravel development and then front-end development to make sure that we can access that data and handle the communication with our API. Be sure to stick around, and as always, happy coding.